I want to thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for being here. General Kelly, I wanted to follow up because this is a topic that you and I have talked about in the past when you were Southcom Commander. And one of the things that struck me is I have been working on the demand side with people like Rob Portman as we've worked on for several years what's called the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act that was passed in the Senate in the last few weeks. And so it has a prevention piece, a treatment piece, and some support in terms of the relationship between prescription drugs and heroin. So, but I want to get to this interdiction issue too, because these drug cartels have been particularly clever. They have flooded this market and driven down the price of heroin and gone to rural areas in New Hampshire and Ohio and other places in this country. And so I actually think that the demand side, we have to do all we can to get at, but we also need to drive the price up on the supply side. And when you were Southcom Commander, I remember you testifying about, and I think today your written testimony reflects that, we see a lot of these drugs coming over, but we're not putting as much teeth into the interdiction piece as we possibly could. In fact, what you said is the effort to get at our drug demand begins or should begin on the cartel's end of the field with much greater effort, and the U.S. military is almost absent in the effort due to almost total lack of naval forces. So as someone who serves jointly on the Armed Services Committee, what can we do to help on that end, working with our partners, obviously Border Control, Coast Guard, law enforcement, that could give more assets to what we need to do while we're working on the demand side, because I think this is an important piece as well.
We need a bigger Navy. That's the answer. I mean, last year in Southcom, joint effort, and again, law enforcement is as important to me down there, or was as important to me down there as naval forces and Coast Guard. But 70% of the 191 metric tons of cocaine that we took out of the flow, and this is in 1 to 2 ton, generally speaking, 1 to 2 ton loads, 70% would not have been taken had it not been for the occasional Canadian ship that shows up down there, or the Dutch buoy tender, Coast Guard, the occasional French ship or UK ship. 70%. Our Navy is absent for a lot of different reasons, a lot of things going on around the world. The Coast Guard Commandant, when he first came in, decided to double the number of cutters.
Right.
That's good, but that is only 3 or 4. And as I say, the way to get at this problem, cocaine problem, is when it's on the high seas, when it's still moving before it makes landfall. Methamphetamines and heroin produced in Mexico. That doesn't move through the transit zone, so to speak. So that really does become how closely can we work with the Mexicans to get vast quantities of those drugs. You know, their best counter-drug organization down there are the Mexican Marines. They do very, very, very well, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But they do take a lot of drugs in the movement. But you know, if you're not getting a lot of it to drive up the price, you know, one of the things that I think I learned from the DEA, here on Capitol Hill, to buy an illegal OxyContin or something like that, Percocet, something like that, a single pill will cost you about $90, about $90. The same amount of heroin to get you to the same place is $6.
Right. So
unless and that's why they moved to heroin. And unless you can do something about inhibiting the flow, and I don't believe that is entirely a southwest border issue. I think it's deep, deep down in Mexico, Sinaloa, places like that. But again, our drug demand have turned vast amounts of Mexico into insurgent-held, if you will, insurgent-held regions that are dominated by the Guzmans of the world, and not even their army will go in there. So the problem is, again, the demand, and frankly, in my mind, not to criticize countries like Mexico or Honduras or others for not doing enough, because I spent the last 3 years of my life looking north, not south, and they would tell us, look, we're doing the best we can down there. Why don't you get your arms around your demand?
Mm-hmm. And that gets me, Dr. Helton, you know, knowing what has happened with the Legacy Foundation, having been Attorney General myself before I served in the Senate, and you know, I have two young children. I have an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I have to tell you, their attitude towards smoking totally different than when I was a kid. They literally see someone smoking on the other side of the road, and this isn't something because their parents have said this. They will move to the other side of the road. And so the notion that we can't do an ad campaign that would really focus on this issue, and especially I think the focus on the opiate issue, both on the prescription drug as you've identified, because the national data shows 4 out of 5 people start with the prescription drugs and then go to heroin. I believe we can do it. But something you said is really interesting, and I think we're trying to support efforts here to get resources toward the prevention piece. And that is this: how do we structure this in a way that if we give the federal resources, along combining with state and local, we put it all together and we say, we are going to go after this, and we're going to get this message out. How do we do it in a way that it's a sufficient body that doesn't get the sort of bureaucracy stifling, well, that message is too troubling, or that message, you have a talented ad organization that's researched it and done the data and then came up with this, and that was what was so effective. I remember seeing the guy on the smoking campaign with the tracheotomy. I mean, that, you remember that. But do you have any thoughts for us on how we could structure something that would give sufficient, the Legacy Foundation had its own, had its support and independence as a nonprofit that was formed. Obviously, there's an oversight board, many attorney generals involved, but you had the sufficient authority and flexibility to be able to do a really hard-hitting campaign. And that's what we need. We can't sugarcoat this with our young people. We can't sugarcoat this with adults. Otherwise, we're not going to get this message through. And I've met too many families that their sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, grandchildren have died, and it's not sugarcoating for what our families are experiencing. So I just want to get, how do we do this?
So I have two models that I would recommend. One is driven by the federal government, and one is a more private model driven by the states. In terms of one driven by the federal government, I would create, I actually think NIDA or SAMHSA would not be a bad place to rest the bidding, but I would open it up for a national bid, and I would leave it alone once it's won. What hurt the ONDCP campaign, and I've pored over their results for years and been very disheartened because they have a fabulous staff, still do, is now drugfree.org. But they were not allowed to do what would do the job. And I believe the job can be done. I came to Legacy making the following statement: I don't think you can advertise your way out of an epidemic, and I believed it at the time. And in fact, I was almost going to stop the national campaign because we were pouring $100 million of money into it in the first year, and we did not have any peer-reviewed literature. And luckily, in February, a paper came out from Florida that showed a 40% decline in middle school smoking and a 20% decline in high school smoking, and in good conscience, I could say, go ahead, let it go. Within 6 months, we were in court. We were in court for 7 years and $17 million worth of litigation trying to shut us down. So one thing you need to understand is when you go after over the prescription opioids, which are saturating our young people and saturating young adults and producing the resurgent heroin epidemic, you will be going up against the pharmaceutical industry. So one model is the model I just described. The second model may be preferable, or maybe it's a parallel model. You do something not unlike what Washington did Washington State, in terms of OxyContin and its effects. You do basically an MSA focused on the unintended, in quotes, consequences of pharmaceutical misadventures in pushing pain analgesics that in turn lead to heroin addiction, and sow the seeds in our young kids who just want to get a root canal, that the next thing you know, 5 years later, they're a heroin addict. Not a good idea. There are fixes, but it will unleash a storm of unhappiness on the part of the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, I have to assure you, first of all, the storm of unhappiness that we're in right now, of people who are dying and lost incredible people who had such potential, that is a storm of unhappiness, and the other storm, as big as it could be, is minor compared to this storm.